Every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The sky over the Pacific Northwest on November 24, 1971, was a churning inkwell of black. A cold, relentless rain, driven by a biting wind, lashed against the windows of the terminal at Portland International Airport. It was the day before Thanksgiving, a time of hurried transit, of people rushing to be somewhere else, to be with someone else. Inside the terminal, the air was warm with the low hum of conversations and the scent of jet fuel. It was just another Wednesday, another evening of routine departures. Among the anonymous faces in the crowd was a man, unremarkable in nearly every way. He walked to the counter for Northwest Orient Airlines and purchased a one-way ticket for the 30-minute flight to Seattle. He paid in cash. The name he gave was Dan Cooper. He was in his mid-40s, perhaps 6 feet tall, with a quiet businesslike demeanor. He wore a dark suit, a crisp white-collared shirt, and a narrow black tie, fastened with a mother-of-pearl tie clip. He carried a dark raincoat and an attaché case. On board the Boeing 727-100, he took his seat 18C in the rear of the aircraft. He lit a Raleigh cigarette and ordered a bourbon and soda from the flight attendant. He was calm. He was polite. He was utterly ordinary. The plane, designated Flight 305, taxied onto the runway and at 2:50 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, climbed into the bruised, storm-tossed sky. As the aircraft ascended over the dense, dark forests of Washington state, the man in seat 18C beckoned the flight attendant, a 23-year-old named Florence Schaffner. He handed her a folded piece of paper. In an age of flirtatious businessmen and passed phone numbers, Schaffner assumed it was just that. Annoyed, she slipped the note unread into her purse. The man leaned closer. "Miss," he said quietly, "you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." The words, spoken without malice or excitement, hung in the air between them, a quiet tear in the fabric of a normal day. Florence retrieved the note. The words were written in neat, all-capital letters with a felt-tip pen. She read the message, and the reality of her situation, of everyone's situation on Flight 305, solidified into a cold, sharp point of fear. The man opened his briefcase just enough for her to see a glimpse of what was inside: 8 red cylinders, a large battery, and a tangle of wires. It looked exactly like a bomb. The next 5 hours would become one of the most audacious and baffling criminal acts in American history. A hijacking that ended not with a confrontation on a tarmac, but with a lone figure leaping from the back of a jetliner into a freezing, windswept darkness, clutching a fortune, and disappearing so completely that he seemed to evaporate into the night itself. He became a ghost, a legend, a blank space in the annals of crime. Tonight, we dissect the anatomy of an unsolved legend. We will explore not just the crime committed by the man the world would come to know as D.B. Cooper, but the intricate anatomy of the mystery he left behind. The minute forensic clues that have been debated for half a century, the frustratingly brilliant simplicity of his plan, and the strange cultural alchemy that transformed a dangerous felon into an American folk hero. We will examine how a man, in one single act of defiance, managed to leap out of a plane and into immortality. Florence Schaffner, her professional composure masking a rising panic, walked forward to the cockpit and informed the pilots of the situation. Captain William Scott, a veteran aviator, maintained a calm exterior as he radioed air traffic control, relaying the hijacker's demands. The voice of Dan Cooper, filtered through the flight attendants, was steady and devoid of agitation. He wanted $200,000 in unmarked $20 bills. He wanted 4 parachutes, 2 primary civilian back chutes, and 2 reserve chest chutes, and he wanted a fuel truck standing by in Seattle to refuel the plane upon arrival. The choice of demands was peculiar and showed a surprising degree of forethought. $200,000 was a significant sum, but not an impossible one to assemble quickly. In today's money, it would be equivalent to over $1.5 million. The request for unmarked bills was standard, but the specificity of $20 bills was clever. A bag containing 10,000 $20 bills would weigh approximately 21 pounds, a manageable weight for a man to carry, even during a parachute jump. The demand for 4 parachutes was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. It immediately created a chilling ambiguity. Did he have an accomplice on board? Or was he planning to take a hostage, perhaps one of the crew members, with him? The most likely reason, investigators would later conclude, was to ensure the authorities wouldn't provide him with sabotaged or dummy parachutes. If he forced someone else to jump with him, they would have to be confident all 4 chutes were functional. It was a simple, elegant way to guarantee his own safety. While the passengers on board Flight 305 remained blissfully unaware of the drama unfolding, a massive coordinated effort exploded on the ground. The FBI was notified, and the president of Northwest Orient Airlines, Donald Nyrop, made the swift decision to cooperate fully. His priority was the safety of the 36 passengers and 6 crew members. Complying with the ransom demand was not a question. The challenge was execution. FBI agents in Seattle scrambled to gather the money. They went to several local banks, collecting stacks of random, non-sequential $20 bills to meet Cooper's unmarked requirement. However, this was the FBI. Nothing would be left to chance. As the cash was gathered, every single one of the 10,000 bills was hastily photographed on microfilm, preserving their serial numbers for eternity. It was a race against time, a frantic effort to create a financial breadcrumb trail that they hoped would one day lead them to their man. Simultaneously, a search was underway for the parachutes. The request for civilian chutes, not military-grade ones, sent officials scrambling. They eventually located a suitable set at a local skydiving school. As the 727 circled in a holding pattern over Puget Sound, burning fuel to reduce its landing weight, the hijacker remained a picture of composure. He ordered a second bourbon and soda and insisted on paying for it. When flight attendant Tina Mucklow, who had become his primary liaison, tried to refuse the money, he insisted. He was a customer. He even tried to give her the change. It was a surreal moment of civility in the midst of a federal crime. He was, by all accounts, a gentleman bandit. He was never cruel, never agitated, never abusive to the crew. He was quiet, thoughtful, and firm. When the plane was ready for its final approach to Seattle-Tacoma Airport, he had the lights in the cabin dimmed. A tactical move to make it harder for any potential police snipers on the ground to see inside. The man calling himself Dan Cooper. At 5:39 p.m., Flight 305 touched down at SeaTac. Cooper directed Captain Scott to taxi to a remote, brightly lit section of the airfield, far from the main terminals. He had the window shades on the left side of the plane closed to protect his identity from anyone watching. Once the ransom money, packed in a heavy canvas bank bag, and the parachutes were delivered to the aircraft by a lone airline employee, Cooper kept his word. He allowed all 36 passengers and flight attendant Florence Schaffner to deplane. The freed hostages walked across the wet tarmac, their Thanksgiving homecomings now colored by a story they would tell for the rest of their lives. But the ordeal was far from over. 4 people remained on board with the hijacker: Captain Scott, First Officer William Ratachak, Flight Engineer Harold Anderson, and Flight Attendant Tina Mucklow. With the plane now being refueled, Cooper outlined the second phase of his plan. It was here that his expertise became truly apparent. He instructed the flight crew on a precise and unusual flight path. They were to fly southeast, towards Mexico City. The plane was to remain at a low altitude, under 10,000 feet, a critical detail, as breathing at higher altitudes without supplemental oxygen would be difficult, and the temperature would be more survivable. The aircraft's landing gear was to remain down, and the wing flaps set to 15 degrees. This configuration would force the Boeing 727 to fly at its minimum possible speed, roughly 185 miles per hour, creating a more stable platform for a parachute jump. Finally, he ordered that the cabin remain unpressurized. These were not the demands of a desperate man making things up as he went along. These were the highly specific instructions of someone with an intimate knowledge of aviation and the performance capabilities of a Boeing 727. The request to keep the cabin unpressurized was key. On a normal commercial flight, the cabin is pressurized to a comfortable equivalent of about 8,000 feet, while the plane itself may be at 35,000 feet. Depressurizing the cabin at altitude would be catastrophic. By keeping the plane at 10,000 feet and unpressurized, the air pressure inside and outside would be equal, allowing a door to be opened in flight without a violent explosive decompression. And the Boeing 727 had a unique feature that made it the perfect vehicle for Cooper's plan: the aft air stair. It was a staircase at the very rear of the fuselage that could be lowered from inside the plane, even during flight. It was designed for use at smaller airports without jet bridges. Crucially, it was out of sight of the cockpit crew, and when lowered, did not create the kind of aerodynamic disruption that opening a side door would. Cooper had selected his aircraft and his escape route with surgical precision. After a nearly 2-hour delay on the ground due to a minor mechanical issue with the refueling truck, and a brief argument with the FAA about his flight plan, Flight 305 was finally ready. At 7:40 p.m., the plane took off again, lifting into the stormy night sky with its mysterious passenger and his fortune. He told Tina Mucklow to go into the cockpit and stay there with the door closed. Before she left, he tried to give her some of the ransom money. She refused. It was his last interaction with any other human being. The cockpit crew, now isolated, could only follow his instructions and wait. As the plane flew south over Washington, Cooper was alone in the darkened passenger cabin. He methodically began his preparations. He took off his tie and left it on his seat. He then presumably began the difficult task of securing the 21-pound bag of money to his body. How he did this remains a point of speculation. Some theories suggest he may have used the cord from one of the parachutes he was leaving behind. Others suggest he simply had a system pre-planned. Around 8 p.m., a warning light flashed in the cockpit. It indicated that the aft air stair was being opened. Captain Scott got on the intercom and asked Cooper if he needed any assistance. "No," was the sharp, singular reply. It was the last they would ever hear from him. A few minutes later, at approximately 8:13 p.m., the crew felt a sudden oscillation, an upward movement of the aircraft's tail section. It was subtle, but noticeable. They believed this was the moment. somewhere over the dense, unforgiving wilderness of southwestern Washington, in the midst of a raging thunderstorm with wind speeds over 100 miles per hour and a wind chill well below freezing, Dan Cooper stepped off the air stair and into the abyss. He disappeared into the night, into history, and into legend. The plane continued on its prearranged flight path. After about 2 hours, with no further contact from the cabin, the crew cautiously landed at Reno Tahoe International Airport at 10:15 p.m. They didn't know for certain if Cooper was still on board. Perhaps he had passed out or the jump had gone wrong. Armed federal agents surrounded the aircraft, prepared for any possibility. They boarded cautiously, moving through the empty, silent cabin. They found it deserted. All that was left of their suspect were 2 of the 4 parachutes, the stub of his Raleigh cigarettes in the ashtray, and the black clip-on tie he had left on seat 18C. The man and the money were gone. The investigation, codenamed NORJAK for Northwest Hijacking, began immediately. It would become one of the longest, most expensive, and most exhaustive manhunts in the history of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The first and most critical task was to define the jump zone. Where exactly had Dan Cooper landed? This was a far more complex problem than it seemed. The plane was flying through a storm, its exact position known only within a certain margin of error. The crew only knew the approximate moment of the jump, based on the pressure bump. The FBI had to calculate the plane's position, factor in its speed and altitude, and then try to model the parachute's descent through violent, unpredictable winds. The result was a vast, sprawling search area, centered near the small town of Ariel, Washington, in the heart of the rugged Lewis River Valley. It was some of the most difficult terrain imaginable: dense forests, steep ravines, and thick underbrush, all blanketed in cold, wet, late-autumn misery. For weeks, the FBI, aided by over 400 U.S. Army soldiers from Fort Lewis, conducted a massive ground search. They scoured the woods on foot. Helicopters crisscrossed the sky. They even brought in a submarine to search the depths of Lake Merwin, a large reservoir in the area. They found nothing. Not a parachute, not a scrap of clothing, not a single $20 bill. It was as if Cooper and his bounty had been swallowed by the earth. As the ground search yielded no results, the investigation fanned out across the country. The FBI began interviewing and eliminating potential suspects at a furious pace. They started with anyone who had a criminal record for similar crimes. They looked at disgruntled airline employees. They investigated military paratroopers and civilian skydivers. The composite sketches, based on the descriptions from the flight crew, were circulated nationwide. They depicted a man with dark hair, dark eyes, and indistinct Caucasian features, a face that could belong to almost anyone. It was during this initial media frenzy that a crucial error was made, one that would cement the hijacker's name in the public consciousness forever. A reporter in Oregon, rushing to meet a deadline, confused the hijacker's alias, Dan Cooper, with a local man by that same name who had been questioned by police and quickly cleared. The reporter asked the police if they were investigating a man named D.B. Cooper. The name stuck. From that point on, the mysterious skyjacker was no longer Dan Cooper. He was D.B. Cooper, a name that would become synonymous with daring, mystery, and the perfect crime. Over the next 5 years, the FBI investigated more than 800 suspects. None could be definitively linked to the crime. The case grew colder with each passing year. The physical evidence left on the plane was frustratingly sparse. The cigarette butts yielded saliva, but DNA technology was still decades away. The fingerprints lifted from the cabin were either from other passengers or not usable. The only truly unique item was the black J.C. Penney tie. It was a cheap, ordinary accessory, but it was his. It was the only piece of his identity he had failed to take with him. For years, it sat in an evidence locker, a silent witness. Then, in 1978, a new piece of evidence surfaced, not from the forest, but from a deer hunter. He found a placard, torn and weathered, containing instructions for lowering the aft stairs of a Boeing 727. It was discovered within the primary search area, reigniting hope that the rest of the evidence was nearby. Investigators believed it had likely been ripped from the staircase as Cooper jumped. A renewed, intensive search of the area was launched, but once again it turned up nothing. The case seemed destined to remain a complete and utter blank. Then, on a cold February afternoon in 1980, nearly 9 years after the hijacking, a discovery was made that would change everything, and simultaneously solve nothing. An 8-year-old boy named Brian Ingram was on a family vacation, digging a fire pit on a sandy stretch of the Columbia River shoreline known as Tina Bar. About 3 inches below the surface, his fingers closed around a set of crumbling, rubber-banded packets. It was money. Rotting, waterlogged stacks of $20 bills. When his family took the money to the authorities, the FBI confirmed the impossible. The serial numbers on the bills were a match. It was a portion of D.B. Cooper's ransom. The discovery of $5,800 of the ransom money at Tina Bar was the single most significant breakthrough in the history of the investigation. But it was a breakthrough that created more questions than answers. Tina Bar was located roughly 20 miles downstream from the originally proposed jump zone. The find immediately threw all previous search efforts into doubt. How did the money get there? 3 dominant theories emerged. The first and most straightforward was that the original search area was wrong. Cooper had actually jumped much further south than believed and landed in or near the Columbia River, losing part of the money in the process. He could have drowned, his body and the rest of the cash washing out to the Pacific Ocean. A second theory suggested that Cooper survived the jump, landed safely somewhere in the forest, and for some unknown reason, buried a portion of the money at Tina Bar, perhaps intending to come back for it later. This seemed less likely given the money's decomposed state, which suggested prolonged exposure to water and sand. The third theory was the most complex and, to many investigators, the most compelling. It involved a detailed analysis of the river itself. Geologists and hydrologists were brought in to study the area. They determined that Tina Bar was not a natural part of the riverbank in 1971. It had been formed by dredge material that was pumped out of the riverbed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in 1974. This meant the money could not have been buried on the beach in 1971 because the beach didn't exist yet. The money had to have been in the river, washed down from one of its northern tributaries, likely the Washougal River, which drained a significant portion of the area south of the original drop zone. It was then scooped up by a dredging vessel in '74 and deposited on the shore, where it remained buried until young Brian Ingram found it 6 years later. This theory reshaped the entire geographic focus of the investigation, shifting the likely landing spot miles south of the original search grid. But even with this new information, searches of the Washougal River basin proved as fruitless as the original efforts. The discovery of the money was a tantalizing clue, a single waterlogged piece of a vast, invisible puzzle. It proved that Cooper had jumped with the money and that at least some of it had left his possession, but it offered no definitive clue as to whether he survived the fall. The fact that the bundles were still bound by their original rubber bands led some to believe they had simply fallen from the money bag during the violent descent, a free-floating packet of evidence tumbling through the storm. With the trail once again cold, the case returned to the realm of suspects and theories. Over the decades, a parade of individuals has been put forward, by law enforcement, by private investigators, and by their own families, as the real D.B. Cooper. Of the hundreds considered, a few have risen to the top as particularly compelling candidates. Perhaps the most famous is Richard McCoy Jr. On the surface, the parallels are stunning. In April 1972, just 5 months after the Cooper hijacking, McCoy, a Vietnam veteran, Mormon Sunday school teacher, and avid skydiver, hijacked a United Airlines flight. He boarded the plane with a grenade and an empty pistol, demanded $500,000 and 4 parachutes, and after receiving the ransom, parachuted out of the back of a Boeing 727 over Utah. The similarities were so striking that many believed the FBI had found their man. McCoy was captured 2 days later, convicted, and sentenced to 45 years in prison. He later escaped, but was killed in a shootout with FBI agents in 1974. For years, a book titled D.B. Cooper, The Real McCoy, championed the theory that he and Cooper were one and the same. The FBI, however, officially ruled him out. They cited several key discrepancies. The descriptions provided by the flight attendants on Flight 305 did not perfectly match McCoy. More importantly, McCoy had a confirmed alibi. He was at home in Utah having Thanksgiving dinner with his family the day Cooper hijacked the plane in Portland. While the copycat theory is strong, the evidence suggests McCoy was an imitator, not the originator. Another prominent suspect emerged decades later from a deathbed confession. In 1995, a man named Dwayne Weber, dying of kidney disease, turned to his wife Jo and said, "I am Dan Cooper." After his death, his widow began to investigate his past. She discovered he had a criminal record and had served time in a prison not far from the Portland airport. She found an old plane ticket with the airport code SeaTac. She recalled a trip they took to the Columbia River in 1979, where Dwayne had walked down to the water's edge alone. And most eerily, she remembered him talking in his sleep about leaving fingerprints on the aft stairs. The circumstantial case was compelling, and the FBI took it seriously enough to compare Dwayne Weber's DNA against the partial profile they had managed to develop from the saliva on Cooper's cigarette butts. There was no match. The suspects kept coming. There was Kenneth Christensen, a former Army paratrooper and a mechanic for Northwest Orient Airlines. He was proposed as a suspect by a private investigator in the 2000s. The theory argued he had the technical knowledge, the skydiving experience, and as an employee, a potential motive of grievance against the company. He lived near the search area, and his physical description was a decent match. He even reportedly bought a house with cash shortly after the hijacking. But like all the others, there was no direct smoking gun evidence to link him to the crime. More recently, a woman named Marla Cooper came forward with a story about her late uncle, a man named Lynn Doyle Cooper, or LD. She claimed to have childhood memories of her uncle arriving at their family's Thanksgiving celebration in 1971, the day after the hijacking, battered and bruised. She said he claimed his injuries were from a car accident, but that he later confessed to the family that he was the hijacker. She recalled him being obsessed with the comic book hero Dan Cooper, a French-Canadian Air Force pilot, which could explain the choice of alias. The FBI investigated her claims, considering them credible, but once again, the evidence was not conclusive enough to close the case. L.D. Cooper remains just one more tantalizing possibility in a sea of unknowns. As the years turned into decades, and the list of suspects grew without a single positive identification, investigators turned their attention back to the one piece of evidence that had been with them since the very beginning: the tie. In the 21st century, new forensic technologies offered a chance to make the old evidence speak. In 2001, an attempt was made to extract a full DNA profile from the tie, but the sample was too small and too contaminated after years of handling to be definitive. Then, in 2009, a team of citizen scientists, organized by a paleontologist from the Burke Museum in Seattle, was given unprecedented access to the tie by the FBI. Using powerful electron microscopes, they conducted a particle analysis, examining the microscopic dust and debris trapped in the fibers of the fabric for over 30 years. What they found was fascinating. The tie contained traces of pure, unalloyed titanium and an alloy of stainless steel. It also contained particles of bismuth and antimony. These are not common elements one would encounter in an office or on the street. They are rare industrial metals. Further analysis in 2017 identified even more specific particles, including cerium and strontium sulfide. This unique elemental cocktail pointed towards a very specific kind of workplace. The combination of titanium, a key component in aircraft manufacturing, and other rare metals, strongly suggested that Dan Cooper may have worked as an engineer or a manager in a high-tech aerospace or chemical manufacturing facility. One of the few places at the time that used these specific elements in close proximity was Boeing's plant in Kent, Washington, which worked on projects like the supersonic transport plane. The tie seemed to be telling a story, that Dan Cooper wasn't just a random criminal, but likely an insider, a man who worked with the very machines he would later use to commit his crime. This forensic ghost print, invisible for decades, painted a portrait of a man who was not just a daredevil, but a professional working at the cutting edge of Cold War-era technology. In July of 2016, 45 years after Flight 305 took off from Portland, the FBI made an official announcement. They were closing the active investigation into the D.B. Cooper case. The NORJAK file, which had swelled to over 60 volumes, would be moved to the archives. The resources, they explained, could be better used on cases with a higher probability of resolution. They would no longer actively assign agents to the case, but would continue to accept any physical evidence related to the parachutes or the ransom money that might emerge. The manhunt was over. And so, the case rests. It is a perfect circle of mystery, with no beginning and no end. Every clue is a dead end. Every suspect is a ghost. Every theory is a plausible fiction. Did he survive the jump? Most experts in parachuting and survival believe the odds were overwhelmingly against him. To jump into a 200-mile-per-hour windstorm at night in freezing rain over mountainous terrain, wearing only a business suit and a raincoat, is practically a suicide mission. The wind shear alone could have shredded his parachute. If he survived the descent, he would have faced a brutal landing in the dense Douglas firs, followed by the challenge of surviving hypothermia in the wilderness. It is very likely that Dan Cooper died that night. His body and the remaining $194,000 lost forever in the vast, remote landscape of the Pacific Northwest. But the discovery of the money at Tina Bar keeps the door to survival slightly ajar. And it is this sliver of possibility, this lack of a final answer, that has allowed the story to flourish. D.B. Cooper is America's only unsolved skyjacking. It is a crime without a resolution, without a final chapter, and into that void has rushed a torrent of fascination, speculation, and myth-making. This is the final, and perhaps most interesting piece of the case's anatomy, its transformation into a cultural legend. Why did this man, a felon who terrorized a flight crew and committed a serious crime, become a folk hero? The answer lies in the unique character of the crime itself. First, it was non-violent. Cooper was polite and never harmed anyone. He was not a monster, he was a mystery. Second, it was audacious. The sheer nerve of the plan, demanding a fortune and then leaping from a plane to disappear, captured the public imagination. It was a plot straight out of a Hollywood movie. And third, there was the context of the times. In 1971, America was a nation in turmoil, mired in the Vietnam War, and deeply distrustful of large institutions and the government. In this environment, the story of one man in a business suit who single-handedly outsmarted a major airline, the FBI, and the entire federal government had a powerful anti-establishment appeal. He wasn't robbing a person, he was robbing a faceless corporation. He was David versus Goliath, and in this story, David got away clean. He became a symbol of freedom, of rebellion, of the fantasy of chucking it all and simply vanishing. The town of Ariel, Washington, near the center of the search area, has held an annual Cooper Day festival for years. He has been the subject of books, films, documentaries, and songs. He is a modern myth, a blank canvas onto which we can project our own desires for escape and adventure. He is the ghost in the machine of modern life, a testament to the idea that even in a world of surveillance and systems, one person can still, somehow, slip through the cracks. The anatomy of this legend, therefore, is built not on a body of evidence, but on the absence of one. It is a structure made of unanswered questions. Who was he? Was he an aerospace engineer, a disgruntled veteran, a common criminal with an uncommon plan? Did he survive? Is it possible that an old man, living somewhere under a different name, knows the answer, or does his skeleton lie scattered and forgotten in some dark, undiscovered corner of the Washington woods? The silence that followed his leap from the plane has been filled with a half-century of noise, of speculation, of wonder. The man who called himself Dan Cooper wanted $200,000. But in the end, he achieved something far more valuable and far more lasting. By stepping out of that airplane into the cold black night, he traded his identity for a strange sort of immortality. He ensured that as long as people love a good mystery, his name would never be forgotten. He did not just vanish from a plane, he vanished into folklore, leaving behind nothing but a cheap tie, a few rotting bills on a riverbank, and a perfect enduring question mark. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.